wanted to just mention something about Einstein's religion, because this is going to be a really interesting, and this is where I think probably those of us who are members of the Birmingham Temple are probably totally sympathetic and very much in line with Einstein's view of the cosmos, view of religion. Some of us, Einstein, to be clear, was not an atheist. I know that some of us are atheists who are in the Birmingham, the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, sorry. But some of us are also, like Einstein, agnostics. And Einstein often talked about himself in, as a follower of Spinoza. And of course, it's interesting that our Sunday school is known as, Spinoza, follows Spinoza. And Spinoza believed that there was some kind of harmony to the universe that was provided by some force, some natural force. Yeah. All right, so we're trying to now, let's see, Lenore, if you want to just quickly introduce yourself to everybody, and very quickly, but one or two sentences, and then also say, what was your impression of Albert Einstein? What was the one impression that you had prior to maybe any of the reading of the Einstein on Politics?
Okay. I'm Lenore Kingston. I'm in Colorado. I used to be I am a member right now of the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, but I actually taught in the Sunday school at Birmingham Temple with Tamara Colton for many years, 4th and 5th grade. Anyways, so.
And a wonderful teacher. You had one of my kids. You were wonderful.
Oh, well, oh, okay.
Annie. Yeah, Annie Linden, I think you had. Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, I loved it, but So as far as, I knew that Einstein, the only thing that I really knew was that Einstein regretted the devastation from Nagasaki and Hiroshima and was really worried. That I knew for a long time.
Yeah.
That was the main thing that I knew.
Yeah, and in the authors of the book on Einstein on Politics, which I hope you all have, made very clear that the last period, the third period that they try to highlight of his activism was in that period of 1945 to 1949, when he really spoke up for some kind of control of nuclear weapons, where he was really opposed to the idea of some kind of mutual destruction and war, that he looked for a world government to rein in the superpowers and the nuclear powers, and but we'll talk a lot more about that. So yes, he was certainly very, very agitated by what had happened with the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in fact, his co-writer of that letter to Roosevelt, Leo Zillard, the other physicist, Hungarian Jew, Leo Zillard also was trying to look for a way of, not even dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that there should be, and this is what a small number of the scientists talked about, there should be just some kind of a use of the bomb, but not on a civilian population, somewhere in the ocean, just to warn Japan that this is the devastation that could be unleashed. But of course, that was overridden by the military authorities, not all of whom, by the way, were on board. Eisenhower in his memoirs even talked about not wanting to drop the A-bomb. So there were dissenters to that idea of using the atomic bomb, but there was obviously a lot of momentum and a lot of people who were dedicated, including Truman, obviously, to the use of the weapon. So we're just going around and introducing ourselves because we had a little time warp since most of us were operating on the 7 o'clock prior references in the newsletter, as opposed to the 7:30 reference in the most recent one. So if Susan, if you want to introduce yourself and say a little bit, just a little one sentence or so about who you are, and then your one lasting impression of who Albert Einstein was prior to engaging in any of the reading we've been doing.
Well, I'm Susan. I've been a member for relatively new member, a couple years, and I really don't know much about Albert Einstein. I was surprised today when I was reading in the introduction that even the theory of relativity was politicized at one time.
Oh my goodness, yes. And,
Pardon me?
yes, very
Yeah.
much so. We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
In fact, there were a number of German scientists, particularly of the right, who labeled the whole theory of relativity and part of some of the newer physics as Jewish science.
Right.
And it's thought by some that this labeling of Jewish science impeded the Nazi government from actually developing the atomic bomb, even though the lead scientist on there, Werner Heisenberg, who was the, if you know anything about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, he was one of the primary advocates and developers of quantum mechanics, of the theory of quantum mechanics, which actually Einstein didn't agree with. And Einstein's relativity wasn't as relative as quantum mechanics made it out to be. But we'll get more into that a little bit later. But yeah, I mean, Einstein was pilloried by the right wing in Germany, but not only for his Jewishness, but also because the theory was seen as somehow tainting traditional German science. Yeah, thank you, Katie. So you want to go next? Can you hear me, Katie? Oh, we can't hear you. Okay, you're muted.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm Katie Stocker, and I guess I know I have a broad brush knowledge of Einstein, but I'm looking forward to really delving into it and getting into the book. And unfortunately, I thought I had more time to read the book because I've had it for about a month, and I was putting it off, and yeah, I'm not very far along.
Well, that's
So-
okay. If here's a couple of things I just want to remind people about, and one of them was probably something that I should have been clearer about. Tonight, we're actually not discussing any of the particulars in the book. We're not really going to delve into Einstein's own writings until 2 weeks from tonight. And I've tried to refine even more the general threads and themes that are outlined in the Einstein on Politics book, so that we're dealing with about 3 chapters every 2 weeks of some of the statements.
Good.
So don't feel like you're way behind, because
That's a good thing.
yeah. The only thing that I should have tried to make clear was that people could have read the historical introduction for tonight. That would have been a good way of just providing some backdrop. But it's okay for you to jump right into the readings for next week, which will be about World War I and political engagement. And this is the period of time that the authors of Einstein on Politics identify as his first and most active period, from the 1919 to 1923. So Ned, I think you're the last but not least to have joined us tonight. And thank you everybody for doing that. Remind everybody, please put your name and a good email address in the chat room so I can try to, as clumsily as possible, generate a listserv. But Ned, so what we're doing is just brief introduction and giving an impression, your overall and most compelling impression that you had of Albert Einstein prior to the beginning of this reading of his work.
Okay, well, I'm Ned Greenberg, and actually you just gave me something interesting, that the anti-Semitism of the German right inhibited development of their development of the bomb is possibly the best thing I've ever heard anti-Semitism lead to.
Yes, right. It's an upside.
Yeah, there's a silver lining in everything, I suppose. And for me, I've always just known that he was a humanist and a very clever with the quip, and very
Yes.
quotable man. And so
Yes.
I've enjoyed just a lot of the sayings that come out from Albert Einstein in the past.
Yeah, and again, I think one of the things that Einstein makes clear is when he becomes a really global celebrity, which is in the aftermath of the Eddington solar eclipse expedition in 1919. It's Eddington who really, the English astronomer, and who really takes Einstein's theory of general relativity, 1915. There's actually an interesting film about that too, called Einstein at Eddington, that you might be able to view, I think on Netflix. But when Eddington shows that the theory of general relativity that Einstein, the paper that he produced in 1915, actually predicted what would happen with the solar eclipse in 1915 in terms of the sun's position and Mercury's position. It's then that papers basically announce that Newtonian physics has been overthrown, which to some extent was true and not true. But and Einstein becomes a real celebrity then, and is pounced upon by reporters and finds sometimes the easiest way of trying to get them out of his hair, which was of course pretty easy to begin with, was and pretty unruly to begin with, right? Was to come up with a quip, to make a joke, to act a little silly, and he was uninhibited in that way anyhow. Yeah, that's part of it. So again, thank you for all being here. Let me just quickly try to go over what plans are for the next sessions, so that we're clear about that. And we will be starting at 7 o'clock. Is that okay? Is 7 o'clock too early? All right, I think 7 should be good.
Yeah, I read this last weekly one. Sorry. I thought
No, it's okay. And I think I may have even had a discussion with Jeff at one point about, well, wouldn't make sense maybe to do it 7:30 instead of 7. So, there's a glitch somewhere. So anyhow, so it's not until 2 weeks from tonight, October 6th, where we'll actually be talking about the writings of Albert Einstein. And I've grouped them around the issue of World War I and political engagement, which I think is chapters 1, 4, and 5. Now, what I'd like each of you to do is, believe it or not, this is the teacher in me, you're gonna have an assignment. It's gonna be an easy one, but this is gonna be an assignment nonetheless. If you are up to doing all that reading, and you don't necessarily have to do all of it, but I want you to choose one of the entries in either chapter 1, chapter 4, or chapter 5, which particularly speaks to you for whatever reason, and to be prepared to say, something about that in a minute or two for the following week. So each of us will have an opportunity to share some of what we've read, our interpretation of what we read, and why it speaks to us. Because I actually think there's a lot still in Einstein that is very, very relevant, whether it's his cultural Zionism and what that meant, whether it's his humanistic Judaism and whatever that meant, whether it was his situational pacifism and whatever that might have meant. But all of those things, I think, are still very, very relevant. But at the same time, I think we need to put those in some kind of context. So if you allow me, if you don't mind, the one thing that I would fault of this wonderful edition by Rowe and Schulman of Einstein on Politics, and I'm assuming all of you have the book now, you know, unfortunately, as I explained earlier, I was hoping to maybe have a local bookstore carry it, but it turned out that the cheapest and quickest way to get it was, as I said, unfortunately, through Amazon. So let's hope that money goes right to the X of Jeff Bezos instead of that, you know, the flying, you know what. So let me just very quickly, and we'll have more of a discussion, but I want to do a quick overview of Einstein's background. So he was born in 1879 in Ulm, Germany. Now, I think this is important. You know, his parents were both Jews, but highly secular Jews. They were so secular, in fact, that they didn't mind sending him to a Catholic school for the first, you know, 3 years of his schooling. So his father became involved with his uncle, founding a company that manufactured electrical equipment, alternate current electrical equipment. Now, this is a kind of aside, but there was a big struggle going on about what kind of current would be the current used for the electrical grid at that time. And there's actually a couple really great films about this on, you know, the Westinghouse and Tesla and, you know, all the scientists who were engaged in trying to turn this into a business, turn electrical circuitry and wiring into a business. Anyhow, it turned out his father and uncle didn't do well enough in Germany, so that they had to wind up moving to Italy. But by that time, Einstein had been going to the gymnasium and before he graduates, or right around the time he's about to graduate, he, when his family leaves to go to Italy in 1895, he goes to Switzerland, partly out of his disgust at German methods of pedagogy, this kind of disciplinary, rote thinking. This rubbed him the wrong way. The whole idea of German discipline in particular, and authority, as you'll see, this really rubbed him the wrong way, and it laid the foundation for his criticism of nationalism, for his criticism of any kind of authoritarianism, he when he moves to Switzerland, he renounces his German citizenship. Now he's and you know, eventually he'll get Swiss citizenship, then go back to Germany in 1914 when he's invited in by Max Planck, the premier German physicist of the time, to come into Berlin. But prior to that time, he studies in Switzerland at the Polytechnic School, where he meets Mileva Maric, who will become his first wife. Before they get married, they have an affair. You know, they're like other young people of their generation. They're very much part of the Bohemian vanguard at a certain point. And actually, she becomes pregnant and returns home to Serbia and has the child there, a baby daughter. Now, this is sort of the mystery. This didn't get revealed until like 1986 that they had a child. It was a daughter, and still it's unclear what happened to her because she contracted scarlet fever. It's not clear whether she died or was adopted by somebody else and disappeared from the historical record. So anyhow, he was very much involved with Mileva Maric because she was also in the Polytechnic, and she was the only woman who was trying to understand physics, and she was a pretty intelligent person, but was not able to pass her exams, which was really frustrating. When Einstein passed his exams, he was trying to look around for a job. It became very, very difficult. He thought probably what might help him would be getting Swiss citizenship, which he did, and then through an intervention of a friend, got a position in the Swiss patent office, looking at reading particularly about patents in electricity and their practicality and understanding what the science was behind it. And he finishes up his PhD because he's still trying to, eventually he wants to become professor. He finishes up his PhD in 1905, and it's 1905 that probably one of the most incredible entrees into the genius of science happens. Einstein publishes 4 separate papers that are groundbreaking papers. And this is on photovoltaic effects, on special relativity. I mean, this, it doesn't set the world on fire by any means, because it's only known among a small group of people, but it's enough for him to attain a position at the University of Bern, and then in Zurich, where he's offered this position of theoretical physics. After that, he goes to Prague for a year or so, then back to Zurich, and then in 1914 is invited to come to Berlin, where he's at Humboldt University in theoretical physics again. And it's in 1915 where the groundbreaking paper, which has his famous formula E equals mc squared, energy equals matter speed of light times 2 to the second power, that this is issued in that during that period. And it's not until 1922 where he receives the Nobel Prize in physics. And it's not even for the general theory of relativity. It's for another one of his papers and work that he had done. It's that first period, 1919 and 1923, that the authors of this book also identify as his first period when he's actively really engaged in a lot of thinking and writing about politics, everything from Zionism to pacifism, to and the interesting thing is, of course, as we'll see, 4 weeks from tonight when we look at his writings on Jewish identity and Zionism. He was not a political Zionist. He didn't even, in fact, he supported the binational state. He believed, like Chad Ha'am, in cultural Zionism, that it was important for the Jews to have a homeland, particularly even more so after the rise of fascism. And he continued to believe that throughout his life, even though he was highly critical of the state of Israel and what had gone on with the politics, both Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism. He had a very different way of understanding what Jewish identity. We'll talk more about that, later on. He does visit Palestine. For his only visit is in 1922, when he's there for about 12 days. And then he eventually, he comes to the United States during that period too, of 1921 to 22. He's very much lauded, and he comes in to talk about a Jewish homeland also. But he's also giving lectures at Columbia and California Institute of Technology and other places. He returns to Germany, but comes back to the US in 1930 and 31. He meets Charlie Chaplin, and they both share a lot in common. Anti-war, critical of authoritarianism, and highly infatuated with Mahatma Gandhi. Both of them feel that Gandhi, Chaplin particularly, and Einstein feel that Gandhi is one of the great moral leaders of the 20th century. So by 1933, all along, Einstein, living in Germany, is very wary of German nationalism, of German militarism, which he detests. And he's most shocked, of course, in 1922, when the right wing assassinates the Jewish finance minister of Germany, Walter Rathenau. He is targeted by anti-Semites, particularly when Hitler comes to power in 1933, and then he leaves Germany. There are raids on his house, on his cottage, which was then taken over and used by the Nazi youth movement as a place. And he eventually secures a place in October 1933 at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And he would stay there for the rest of his life until he passes in April of 1955. And again, in this period, 1939, I mentioned earlier, it's with Leo Zillard. After Zillard is particularly alarmed at this paper by two German physicists about the use of uranium to make nuclear fission, that he and Zillard and Edward Teller and Wigner write a letter to Roosevelt, and they say, we're afraid that German scientists may be on the road to developing an atomic weapon or a bomb that we think would be incredibly destructive, and we need the United States to pay some attention to this and maybe start in their own campaign. When he wrote that letter, later he basically says, almost the Yiddish expression, make my hand fall off. What's the Yiddish expression? Somebody knows about this. Somebody surely knows the expression. I don't know the Yiddish well enough to know the expression. But in any case, he regretted, that once that the bomb was made into a weapon and then dropped on the civilian population of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he was, somewhat guilt-stricken. Although, again, to be very precise, he never had anything to do with the Manhattan Project. He didn't participate in the actual production. He didn't even actually know that much about it. He got little inklings maybe here and there, but he was one of those people who the government still was somewhat suspicious about. And certainly by the 1940s and 50s, J. Edgar Hoover was well on his heel, already thinking that he was a communist and he needed to be deported. And more of that at the last session we have when we talk about civil liberties. Einstein took up earlier in 1930, he was very much an advocate because of his opposition to nationalism of pacifism. And in fact, even encouraged young men in 1930 to refuse to sign up for the draft. By 1933, he changed his position. So sometimes to the horror of those who were absolute pacifists, who felt that he had betrayed them. But his primary concern all along was the fear of war and militarism. And when he saw what Germany was doing under Hitler, he really saw the need for people to, be prepared. He's also a great, as we'll see, he is very much an advocate for African Americans. He joined the NAACP in 1940. He fought against the persecution of W.B. Du Bois, who eventually had to flee the country because of allegations of communism. There's much in here that gives us a sense of what an important figure he was. But before I conclude, I just want to come back to one final point, and that is, as some of his biographers make plain, Einstein was not alone in the adoption of these policies. He wasn't an eccentric in the sense that there weren't other voices that were part of what one critic calls a liberal global intelligentsia. And these are people like Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, Mahatma Gandhi, Albert Schweitzer, Romain Rolland, the French writer, who were part of this kind of effort of establishing a general moral watchtower of sorts over what was going on with civilization, or as Gandhi liked to say, when asked about Western civilization, he said, I'd like to, be nice if there was some civilization in the West, because as someone who suffered from Western colonialism, both in South Africa and in India, Gandhi was more than aware of how brutal such a civilization could be. So that's my little spiel. Again, if Wikipedia is good for anything, it's good for always getting a brief biography. And the one thing that I wish they would have included in this book was some of those biographical highlights. I mean, they do it, in all of the intros that they have to each of their chapters, but it'd be nice if it was an index right at the back where you could just go through and see what years where Einstein was and what he was doing in those particular years. So that's my little shtick for tonight. But what I'd like to do is begin the conversation in some area that you may have already, if you've already started reading a little bit of the book, either in the historical introduction or in any of these chapters, without going into great detail, which we'll hope to do in 2 weeks, you know, can you offer some of your own reflections on what you've been reading and how it strikes you?
I can start. I can say that one of the interesting points I've thought about in just reading about him is kind of how he's both an idealist and a pragmatist at the same time, because he talks about things like, you know, world government and advocating that, and yet, you know, he was an ardent Zionist, and then he became a critic, and it's kind of how he evolves based upon the circumstance. At the same time, he's trying to advance some pretty, I mean, I don't think the word is naive, maybe just idealistic philosophies. And it makes him kind of difficult to understand, because there's a contradiction in how he approaches the world.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Ned. The ways in which some people try to, biographers try to follow Einstein when he tracks one way or another, is to say that, you know, it's complicated, that he tried to attune himself often to what the practical realities of the time, without foregoing what he believes is his moral viewpoint of the time. So, you know, when we get to that section on world government, you'll be surprised to find out how around the world, particularly in those countries that have suffered because of World War II, there was an unleashing of desire for world government. There were state legislatures in the United States that signed on to the idea of world government, including the legislature of Tennessee. I mean, when you begin to think about, you know, this wasn't an idea that was just out on the fringes in the aftermath of World War II. The Cold War actually did it in. The Cold War basically doused the enthusiasm because of the rising nationalism and you know, of these superpowers, of the desire for a world government. I mean, there was the UN, and as the UN became more of a forum for sovereign states, which is not what Einstein wanted. Einstein wanted to be, you know, have power over every single army in the world, you know, so that these military couldn't be an instrument of national policy, because it led to, in the 20th century, we saw what it led to. It led to this brutal devastation of human life. Yeah, I think you've sussed out what is a really interesting aspect of Albert Einstein's thinking, that that in order to better understand why at a particular time he could be a pacifist and then change the position so that it seemed to have been a betrayal of his pacifism, you need to understand the threads that are continuous in his thinking. And one of those threads is in particular his Jewish identity. You know, I think that I think that that becomes very much a part of, even though he wasn't religious at all, although early on he did practice as a young boy. He was a little, he tried to be a little bit of religious Jew, but dropped it all and became much more of a Spinozian of the belief of that there is some natural order to the universe. He's not going to try to name it because it's, you know, sort of unknown. So in that way, he's not an agnostic, I'm sorry, he's not an atheist, but he is an agnostic. And that kind of explains one of his quips that often you hear more often than not, and that doesn't really do justice to the complexity of his religious belief, which is God doesn't play dice with the universe. I don't know how many of you have heard that little notion. And what he actually used that as a way of criticizing quantum mechanics. His primary focus throughout the last part of his life was on trying to come up with a unified field theory under which everything could be explained. Now, there are still those who are pressing for that unified field theory. It's a really interesting element of what people are doing in theoretical physics still. And it's certainly been a lot more complicated by wave theory, quantum mechanics, string theory, everything named. Yeah, so that's one thing. And as we work our way through these particular writings of Einstein, we'll try to get a better sense of if, in fact, he can be easily pigeonholed. And I don't think he can be. Yes. Go ahead, Rosalie.
I found the historical introduction interesting from a lot of standpoints, some of the things that you brought up now, but I'm hoping that there's a lot more detail provided in terms of the non-scientific or the non-humane behavior of his fellow scientists, and what he went up against through the Nazi years, trying to do his work, even before being labeled, or criticized for Jewish physicism.
Yeah, there is, there's certainly any number of biographies on Einstein that give you a much better feel for that kind of anti-Semitism that was evident. And probably one of the better biographies is by Walter Isaacson.
Oh, okay.
Who I don't know how he manages to do it. He must have a bunch of helpers, I think, because he writes biographies of people that are enormous, and he writes them pretty quickly. So yeah, Isaacson's one biographer. The other reading that I found particularly helpful on Einstein's politics is by a British political philosopher named Richard Crockett, and it's Einstein and 20th Century Politics. That was by an Oxford University Press in 2016. So there are a number of, if you are so inclined, and you really get turned on by all of Einstein's reading that you're doing, and there's primary source material, there's plenty of secondary source material out there that helps to give you a better sense of what he was up against with people like Leonard in the anti-Semitic German scientific right-wing establishment.
Question though, does he, in this book, does he opine at all in terms of how this affected him or his?
Yeah. I mean, when we get to that section on anti-Semitism, he's very clear about his own personal travails that he runs into, and why he's very constantly skeptical of German. And of course, when he leaves Germany, and throughout that period of the 30s into World War II, given the Holocaust and what transpires, Einstein never went back to Germany, never visited again, never wanted to. I think if he were alive today, he might want to live in Germany as opposed to the United States. And the reason I say that is science seems to be more active in Germany and capable of convincing people to get vaccines than in the United States. I think he'd really be truly flabbergasted. Yes, Elaine.
Well, that's kind of what I was going to say. The two things that stuck out to me in the introduction was the Jewish science thing and the national government thing. And to draw the parallel to what's going on. I mean, I understand that academics and scientists are in competition with each other at times to be the first to do whatever. I mean, it happens, especially when you have private industry scientists developing things, but it just shows what we're going through now, and that people ignore science, evidence, for some other reason, whether it's because the person's Jewish who developed it, or because the sitting president is encouraging vaccines and we don't want to support him, so we're not going to get it. Some kind of ridiculous bias to justify following the anti-science. It's just more of the same.
I think one of the things that is also true, and biographers talk about this, is that as humanistically inclined as Einstein was, and particularly with people who were oppressed or discriminated against, he doesn't have a lot of sympathy for the wickedness, if we can call it that, or the stupidity. Let me put it more in of humanity in general, and more particularly often those who are under the lash of the ideological lash of nationalism, or who buy into any kind of racism. So he doesn't have much tolerance for that. And I think some even go so far as to say that Einstein is a kind of elitist. It's hard, when you are at that level of genius, which clearly he was, for there not to be this sense that you are really separated from the mass of humanity in that sense. Even if you could care for them, you might also be critical. And I think he was critical also because he felt that the Enlightenment values that he still really retained, and that were part of what he received in his own German education, or his self-education, right, of Kant's philosophy of reason. That's very much part of Einstein. And when he finds people acting on the basis of without any reason, he is highly dismissive of that, and is fearful that it will easily turn into the sort of thing that would lead to war and lead to all the kinds of horrors. Which is why Crockett tries to identify him with this long thread of the Enlightenment and calling him a liberal, even though I think that doesn't quite, that's a category again that doesn't quite fit everything that Einstein believed in. Any other kind of questions that you might have now, or comments that you wanted to make about this first session? Again, I want to thank everybody for signing on, and hope that you'll be with us in 2 weeks at 7 o'clock. and that we're going to read, we're going to talk about chapters 1, 4, and 5, which deal with that World War I, post-World War I period and his political engagement. And what I would ask each of you to do is, don't feel like you need to read each and every entry in those 3 chapters. Read as much as you want, but certainly in what you read, try to select one piece that particularly speaks to you for whatever reason, and be prepared to say something about it, in a minute or two, when we meet in 2 weeks on, see, I even got that wrong, right? Did I put down 2 weeks from tonight is October 6th, right? At 7 p.m. And we'll correct the newsletter next time so that it does say 7 p.m. And if everybody, I think everybody has signed in, just left me with an email, which is helpful. And again, I would recommend that there are some films that are also helpful. The National Geographic special on Einstein called Genius, which I think was a 6-part series. Unfortunately, I don't think it's, depending on who you're subscribed to, I don't know. I think it's National Geographic is charging for it. But the movie of Einstein and Eddington, which is really interesting, because it will be a good backdrop, by the way, to our discussion 2 weeks from tonight. If you want to take a look at that movie, which I believe is available through Netflix. So that's an interesting film. Okay. That's it for tonight. I think we'll try to go no longer than an hour and a half, which I think is a good time to get our discussion going and to cover a lot of the themes that we'll want to cover. So, and we're not going to hold it to actually 90 minutes. We'll see. Like tonight, I assumed we were going to be shorter. Again, I appreciate everybody showing up tonight, and good reading. And please don't hesitate if you want to ask me any questions. I think you have my email address. Feel free to email me.